The biopod hissed open with a sound like escaping steam, releasing clouds of crystalline vapor that sparkled under the sterile lighting of the medical bay. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as the last traces of cryogenic suspension left her system. Her dark hair clung to her shoulders in damp strands, and her brown eyes blinked rapidly as they adjusted to consciousness after 2 centuries of dreamless sleep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around her, 3 tall figures in flowing robes watched with expressions that mixed curiosity with barely concealed disgust. Their pale blue skins seemed to shimmer under the artificial lights, and their elongated faces bore the distinctive ridged foreheads of the Velathi species. The leader, whose robes bore intricate silver threading that marked his high rank, stepped forward with movements that suggested both authority and revulsion. "The specimen is awake," he announced to his companions, his voice carrying the melodic tones that characterized Velathi speech. "Begin the preliminary assessments." Elena sat up slowly, her muscles protesting after the long hibernation. She studied her surroundings with the sharp intelligence that had made her one of Earth's most renowned educators before the colony ship disaster that had left her frozen in space for 200 years. The medical bay was clearly alien in design, with curved walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light and instruments that bore no resemblance to human technology. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. The leader tilted his head in what might have been amusement. "You are aboard the research vessel Enlightened Thought, orbiting the 4th moon of Thrender Prime. I am High Scholar Zephon of the Velathi Educational Collective. You, human, are our latest acquisition." The Velathi Educational Collective had ruled the Outer Rim territories for over 3 millennia, their dominance built not on military might but on intellectual superiority. Their society valued learning above all else, but their approach to education had crystallized into rigid patterns that tolerated no deviation from established methodologies. Knowledge was sacred, but it must be acquired through proper channels, following time-honored procedures that had been refined over countless generations. High Scholar Zephon represented the pinnacle of this educational philosophy. His pale blue skin bore the distinctive markings that indicated decades of scholarly achievement, each pattern etched into his flesh representing mastery of a different academic discipline. The silver threading in his robes told the story of his rise through the educational hierarchy, from a humble student to one of the most respected teachers in Velathi space. The discovery of the human colony ship drifting in the void had presented an unprecedented opportunity. Most species they encountered either possessed educational systems too primitive to be worth studying, or had developed along paths so similar to their own that little could be learned. Humans, however, represented something entirely different. Initial scans of the derelict vessel had revealed educational materials and methodologies that defied Velathi understanding. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been selected for revival, not because of any particular academic credentials, though her doctorate in educational psychology and her work developing innovative teaching methods had been noted in the ship's records. She had been chosen because the artificial intelligence systems on the colony ship had identified her as the individual most likely to survive the revival process, while still possessing comprehensive knowledge of human educational practices. The Velathi approach to learning was methodical and hierarchical. Students progressed through carefully structured levels, each building upon the previous one in logical sequence. Knowledge was imparted through formal lectures, recorded materials, and supervised study sessions. Deviation from approved curriculum was not merely discouraged, but was considered a form of intellectual contamination that could corrupt the purity of true learning. Their teaching methods had proven extraordinarily effective for their own species. Velathi's scholars were renowned throughout the galaxy for their expertise in theoretical sciences, mathematical analysis, and philosophical discourse. Their universities attracted students from dozens of worlds, all eager to learn from masters who had perfected the art of intellectual development over countless centuries. Yet despite their successes, High Scholar Zephon had begun to notice troubling patterns in recent decades. Students seemed increasingly passive, content to absorb information without questioning its applications. Innovation had slowed to a crawl, as scholars focused on refining existing knowledge rather than discovering new frontiers. The rigid structure that had made Velathi education so effective was beginning to stifle the very creativity it was meant to nurture. The human educational materials discovered on the colony ship suggested radically different approaches. References to something called experiential learning appeared frequently, along with concepts like hands-on education and learning through trial and error. Most disturbing of all were frequent mentions of physical education and competitive activities that seemed to involve deliberate conflict and violence as teaching tools. Elena gradually became aware of her surroundings as the last effects of cryo-sleep faded from her system. The medical bay was clearly designed for beings much taller than humans, with examining tables and equipment positioned at heights that would have been uncomfortable for someone of her modest stature. The three Velathi scholars observed her with the detached interest of researchers studying a particularly intriguing specimen. "Your species," High Scholar Zephon began, consulting a translucent tablet that displayed scrolling text in flowing Velathi script, "appears to have developed educational methodologies that contradict all established principles of proper learning. We require you to explain these apparent contradictions." Elena swung her legs over the edge of the biopod and stood carefully, testing her balance after the long hibernation. Her movements were watched with intense interest by the three scholars, as if they expected her to demonstrate some exotic human behavior at any moment. "I'm not sure what contradictions you're referring to," she replied, her voice growing stronger as she fully awakened. "Human education encompasses many different approaches depending on the subject matter and the students involved." The second Velathi scholar, whose robes bore patterns indicating specialization in pedagogical theory, stepped forward with an expression of barely contained skepticism. "We have analyzed your educational archives. Your methods appear to deliberately induce confusion, conflict, and even physical discomfort in students. How can such approaches possibly facilitate learning?" Elena almost smiled despite her circumstances. She had encountered similar attitudes throughout her career from educators who believed that learning should be a purely intellectual exercise, divorced from physical experience or emotional engagement. "Could you be more specific about which methods concern you?" High Scholar Zephon activated a holographic display that showed images captured from the colony ship's educational databases. Elena recognized footage from Earth schools, showing children engaged in various activities that the Velathi clearly found disturbing. Students were shown participating in sports competitions, conducting science experiments that involved controlled explosions, and engaging in debates that became heated arguments. "Observe," Zephon said, his tone suggesting he was presenting evidence of serious criminal activity. "Human juveniles are encouraged to engage in physical combat disguised as games. They are deliberately exposed to dangerous chemical reactions in what you call laboratory experiments. Most shocking of all, they are taught to argue with their instructors and challenge established knowledge." The third scholar, whose markings indicated expertise in child development, gestured toward another series of images. "Furthermore, human educational institutions appear to deliberately create stressful situations through examinations, competitions, and public presentations. Students are rated against one another rather than being evaluated on their individual progress toward established learning objectives." Elena studied the holographic displays with growing understanding. To beings who had perfected education as a purely cerebral process, human teaching methods would indeed appear chaotic and violent. The Velathi had eliminated conflict, stress, and physical activity from their learning environments, creating conditions of perfect intellectual peace that allowed for maximum information absorption. "I think I understand your concerns," Elena said carefully. "Your educational system has achieved remarkable results through structured, peaceful learning environments, but human psychology requires different approaches to achieve optimal learning outcomes." High Scholar Zephon's expression suggested that he found this explanation deeply unsatisfactory. "Learning is learning. Knowledge exists independently of the methods used to acquire it. Inefficient or dangerous approaches to education serve only to contaminate the purity of intellectual development." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a younger Velathi whose robes indicated junior academic status. She approached High Scholar Zephon with the deferential posture expected of students addressing their superiors, waiting for permission to speak before delivering her message. "Honored teacher," she said in the formal tones reserved for academic discourse, "the Educational Council has convened to observe the human demonstration. They await your presence in the primary instruction chamber." Zephon nodded dismissively, and the young scholar departed immediately, her head bowed in the prescribed manner for students leaving the presence of their betters. Elena watched this interaction with professional interest, noting the extreme formality and rigid hierarchy that characterized even casual communications within the Velathi educational system. "You will demonstrate human teaching methods," Zephon informed Elena without preamble. "The Educational Council wishes to observe these techniques directly before determining whether any aspects might be worthy of scholarly investigation." Elena felt a familiar excitement building within her. Throughout her career, she had relished opportunities to introduce skeptical educators to innovative teaching approaches. The challenge of convincing the Velathi that human methods had value would be considerable, but she had faced similar resistance before and emerged victorious. "What subjects would you like me to demonstrate?" she asked. The second scholar consulted his tablet before responding. "We have prepared a group of young Velathi who are experiencing difficulties with advanced mathematical concepts. Their progress has been preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Unsatisfactory, despite exposure to our most refined instructional materials. If human methods possess any genuine educational value, perhaps they could assist these struggling students. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Mathematics was an ideal subject for demonstrating the effectiveness of hands-on learning techniques. "How many students will I be working with?" 12 juveniles, the third scholar replied. "They range in age from the equivalent of your human adolescents to young adults. All have demonstrated adequate intellectual capacity in other subjects, but have failed to master the mathematical principles required for advancement to higher levels of study." The Velathi led Elena through corridors that pulsed with soft bioluminescent lighting, past chambers where students sat in perfect rows absorbing knowledge from holographic instructors who delivered information in measured melodic tones. The uniformity was striking. Every classroom followed identical layouts. Every student maintained the same posture of respectful attention. Every lesson proceeded at the same carefully calculated pace. They entered an observation chamber overlooking what the Velathi considered their most advanced instructional facility. The primary instruction chamber was enormous, with curved walls that could display complex three-dimensional visualizations of any conceivable subject matter. Rows of comfortable seats provided optimal viewing angles for large groups of students, while recording equipment captured every moment of the learning process for later analysis and refinement. The Educational Council had assembled to observe the human demonstration. Elena counted 37 Velathi scholars arranged in the traditional hierarchy, with the most senior educators occupying elevated positions, while junior faculty members sat in designated areas below. Their collective attention focused on her with an intensity that would have been intimidating if she hadn't spent decades presenting new educational concepts to skeptical audiences. High Scholar Zephon gestured toward the instruction chamber below. "Your students await. We have provided access to all standard educational materials and equipment. Demonstrate how human methods could possibly succeed where our proven techniques have failed." Elena studied the 12 young Velathi who sat in perfect formation below. They maintained the same rigid posture she had observed throughout the facility, their attention fixed on empty air as they waited for instruction to begin. Their body language suggested resignation rather than enthusiasm, as if they had already accepted their failure to master the mathematical concepts that had defeated their previous efforts. "Before I begin," Elena said, "I need to understand what specific mathematical concepts these students are struggling with." The second scholar activated a display showing complex equations that dealt with multi-dimensional geometric relationships. Elena recognized advanced calculus problems that would challenge even gifted human students, yet these were apparently considered basic requirements for Velathi academic advancement. "These young scholars have been exposed to the material through standard instructional methods," he explained. "They have attended lectures, reviewed recorded materials, and completed supervised study sessions. Despite this comprehensive exposure, they continue to demonstrate inadequate comprehension during formal assessments." Elena nodded as she studied the problems. The mathematics itself was sophisticated, but not impossibly difficult. The issue was likely that the students had been taught to memorize formulas and procedures without developing any intuitive understanding of the underlying concepts. They could recite the information but couldn't apply it creatively to solve novel problems. "I'll need some basic materials," she told the assembled council. "Nothing sophisticated, just some physical objects that I can use for demonstration purposes." High Scholar Zephon's expression suggested that this request confirmed his worst suspicions about human educational methods. "Physical objects? We are discussing advanced mathematical concepts, not elementary lessons for juvenile minds. The materials will help the students develop intuitive understanding of the geometric relationships involved in these problems, Elena explained. Once they can visualize and manipulate the concepts physically, the abstract mathematics becomes much easier to comprehend. The request for physical materials caused considerable discussion among the council members. The Velathi had eliminated such crude approaches from their educational system centuries ago, regarding them as primitive distractions from pure intellectual development. However, their curiosity about human methods eventually overcame their reluctance to permit such irregularities. A collection of basic geometric shapes was provided: spheres, cubes, pyramids, and cylinders in various sizes and colors. To the Velathi observers, these simple objects represented a shocking regression to the most elementary levels of education. In their system, students advanced beyond physical manipulatives before reaching even intermediate academic levels. Elena descended to the instruction chamber and approached the 12 young Velathi with a warm smile that immediately violated every protocol of proper teacher-student interaction. Velathi educators maintained formal distance from their pupils, delivering instruction from elevated positions that reinforced the hierarchical relationship between those who possessed knowledge and those who sought to acquire it. "Good morning," she said, her informal greeting causing several council members to shift uncomfortably in their observation seats. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm here to help you understand some mathematical concepts that have been giving you trouble." The students exchanged confused glances. They had never encountered an instructor who spoke to them as equals, rather than addressing them in the formal academic language reserved for educational discourse. One young Velathi tentatively raised her hand in the gesture used to request permission to speak. "Honored teacher," she began hesitantly, "are we to address you using proper academic protocols?" Elena laughed, a sound that had never before echoed through the hallowed chambers of Velathi education. Several council members actually recoiled as if they had witnessed something profane occurring in a sacred space. "Just call me Elena," she replied. "And you don't need to raise your hand every time you have a question. Education should be a conversation, not a lecture." The revolutionary nature of this statement was not lost on the observing scholars. In Velathi education, students spoke only when called upon, addressed their instructors with elaborate formal titles, and never presumed to engage in casual conversation with their academic superiors. The suggestion that education could be conversational rather than hierarchical challenged fundamental assumptions about the proper relationship between teachers and students. Elena began by asking the students to introduce themselves and explain what aspects of the mathematical problems they found most confusing. This approach violated another basic principle of Velathi education: the belief that student confusion indicated personal inadequacy rather than instructional failure. Proper teaching methods prevented confusion by presenting information in perfectly logical sequences that eliminated all possible misunderstandings. The students responded cautiously at first, clearly uncertain about this unprecedented opportunity to express their difficulties openly. Gradually, however, they began to describe their struggles with visualizing multi-dimensional relationships and understanding how abstract formulas related to geometric reality. Elena listened carefully to each student's concerns, asking follow-up questions that encouraged them to elaborate on their thinking processes. This diagnostic approach was completely foreign to Velathi methodology, which assumed that all students would experience identical learning patterns and require identical instructional approaches. "The problem," Elena told the observing council, "is that these students have memorized procedures without understanding the underlying concepts. They can recite formulas, but they can't visualize what those formulas actually represent." She picked up one of the geometric shapes, a cube, and held it up for the students to examine. "Before we deal with complex equations, let's make sure everyone understands what we're actually calculating." What happened next would have been impossible in any traditional Velathi classroom. Elena began tossing the cube to different students, asking them to identify its properties and describe how its dimensions related to calculations of volume and surface area. The physical act of catching and examining the object engaged multiple senses simultaneously, creating neural pathways that pure intellectual analysis could never establish. The observing council watched in horrified fascination as their orderly instructional chamber was transformed into something resembling a primitive playground. Students moved from their assigned seats, handled objects with their bare hands, and called out answers without waiting for formal permission to speak. The sacred protocols of academic discourse crumbled before their eyes, yet something remarkable was happening to the students themselves. For the first time in their educational careers, they were actively engaged with learning, rather than passively absorbing information. Their body language changed from resigned compliance to genuine curiosity as they began to understand mathematical relationships through direct physical experience. Elena introduced increasingly complex geometric shapes, challenging the students to predict and calculate various properties before verifying their answers through measurement and manipulation. The abstract formulas they had struggled to memorize suddenly made sense when connected to tangible objects they could see and touch. "This is elementary education," High Scholar Zephon observed with barely concealed disgust. "These students are too advanced for such primitive methods." "Actually," Elena replied while helping a student understand the relationship between radius and volume in a sphere, "research shows that physical manipulation enhances learning at all levels. Even graduate students benefit from hands-on approaches to complex concepts." The mention of research caused murmurs of interest among some council members. The Velathi respected empirical evidence, even when it challenged their preconceived notions about proper educational methods. However, most of the observers remained skeptical that such chaotic and undignified approaches could produce meaningful learning outcomes. Elena escalated her methodology by introducing what she called mathematical combat, competitive exercises, where students worked in teams to solve increasingly difficult problems using the geometric shapes as tools. This approach combined physical activity, social interaction, and intellectual challenge in ways that violated every principle of civilized education. The students were divided into groups and given complex geometric puzzles that required them to manipulate multiple shapes simultaneously, while calculating relationships between different dimensional properties. The competitive element added excitement and urgency to the learning process, motivating students to push beyond their comfort zones in pursuit of victory. The Velathi observers watched in shock as their previously passive students became animated participants in their own education. They moved around the chamber freely, collaborated enthusiastically with their teammates, and engaged in heated discussions about mathematical strategies. The formal atmosphere of traditional education dissolved into something that resembled organized chaos. "This is not learning," the third scholar protested. "This is barbaric competition that promotes aggression and conflict among students who should be cooperating in their pursuit of knowledge." Elena paused in her instruction to address this concern. Competition, when properly structured, motivates students to exceed their own expectations. The conflict you're observing is intellectual, not personal. They're arguing about mathematical concepts because they care about getting the right answers. Indeed, the students were engaged in vigorous debates about geometric relationships, challenging each other's calculations, and defending their own interpretations with passionate intensity. This level of engagement was unprecedented in Velathi education, where students typically accepted whatever information their instructors provided without question or discussion. The transformation in the struggling students was remarkable. Concepts that had remained incomprehensible through months of traditional instruction suddenly became clear through physical manipulation and competitive application. Students who had been labeled as mathematical failures began solving complex problems with confidence and creativity. Elena introduced what she called mathematical violence, exercises where students had to solve problems under time pressure, while their teammates shouted encouragement and their opponents attempted to distract them through legitimate but aggressive competition. The intensity of these exercises pushed students to process information rapidly and apply their knowledge under stress. The observing council watched in fascinated horror as their civilized instructional chamber was transformed into something resembling a battlefield. Students called out answers, challenged each other's reasoning, and celebrated victories with emotional displays that would have been considered inappropriate in any traditional educational setting. Yet the results were undeniable. Students who had failed to grasp basic mathematical concepts through months of conventional instruction were now solving advanced problems with remarkable accuracy and speed. Their understanding had progressed from mechanical memorization to genuine comprehension that enabled creative application of mathematical principles. High Scholar Zephon found himself facing an unprecedented dilemma. Every instinct developed through decades of educational expertise told him that the human methods were crude, undignified, and contrary to all established principles of proper learning. Yet the evidence of their effectiveness was mounting before his eyes as previously failing students demonstrated mastery of concepts that had defeated their best efforts under traditional instruction. The session continued for several hours as Elena introduced increasingly sophisticated applications of her violent educational methods. Students engaged in mathematical duels where rapid problem-solving determined victory or defeat. They participated in geometric treasure hunts that required complex calculations to locate hidden objectives. They competed in team challenges that combined physical activity with mathematical analysis in ways that would have been considered impossible under conventional Velathi approaches. Throughout these exercises, Elena maintained careful control over the apparent chaos, ensuring that competitive energy remained focused on educational objectives rather than personal conflicts. Her management of the learning environment demonstrated sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and motivational psychology that the observing scholars had never encountered in their formal training. The most shocking moment came when Elena encouraged students to challenge her own explanations and propose alternative approaches to solving problems. In Velathi education, questioning an instructor's expertise was considered a serious breach of academic protocol that could result in expulsion from educational programs. But what if your method isn't the most efficient way to solve this problem? One brave student asked, after Elena had demonstrated a particular technique. Instead of responding with the outrage that such impertinence would have provoked in any Velathi educator, Elena smiled with genuine pleasure. "Show me your approach. If it works better than mine, we'll use your method instead." The student proceeded to demonstrate an innovative solution that eliminated several steps from Elena's procedure while producing identical results. Elena praised this creativity enthusiastically and immediately adopted the improved method for the remaining exercises. This exchange violated fundamental assumptions about the relationship between teachers and students. In Velathi society, educators possessed complete authority over their subjects because their superior knowledge and training guaranteed the correctness of their instruction. The possibility that students might improve upon their teachers' methods was not merely unlikely, but philosophically impossible. Yet Elena had demonstrated that encouraging student innovation could actually enhance the learning process rather than undermining instructional authority. Students became more engaged when they were treated as creative partners rather than passive recipients of predetermined knowledge. The session concluded with a comprehensive assessment that would have been impossible under traditional Velathi methods. Instead of formal examinations that tested memorized information, Elena challenged students to apply their newly acquired understanding to novel problems they had never encountered before. The results exceeded even Elena's optimistic expectations. Students who had entered the chamber as mathematical failures demonstrated mastery that surpassed many graduates of conventional Velathi programs. More importantly, they had developed confidence and enthusiasm for learning that would serve them well in future educational endeavors. As the last student completed the final challenge, Elena turned to address the assembled educational council. The observation chamber had fallen silent as the scholars struggled to process what they had witnessed. Centuries of educational orthodoxy had been challenged by methods that seemed primitive, yet produced results that exceeded their most optimistic projections for struggling students. "The demonstration is complete," Elena announced. These students now possess genuine understanding of mathematical concepts that had previously defeated them. They can apply this knowledge creatively to solve novel problems, and they have developed enthusiasm for learning that will motivate continued growth. High Scholar Zephon descended to the instruction chamber, his expression revealing internal conflict between professional skepticism and undeniable evidence. He approached the geometric shapes that Elena had used in her instruction, handling them with the reluctance of someone touching objects that might be contaminated with primitive superstitions. "The results are unexpected," he admitted reluctantly. However, this demonstration involved only basic mathematical concepts with a small group of struggling students. Such crude methods could hardly be effective for advanced subjects or gifted pupils. Elena smiled with the confidence of an educator who had faced such skepticism countless times throughout her career. These methods scale to any level of complexity and work with students of all abilities. Would you like me to demonstrate with more advanced concepts? The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. The Velathi Educational Council faced a moment of decision that would determine whether they remained trapped in the limitations of their traditional approaches or opened themselves to revolutionary possibilities that could transform their entire civilization. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and Elena Vasquez stood ready to prove that human education could accomplish what centuries of Velathi scholarship had never imagined possible. The emergency klaxons pierced through the Enlightened Thought's corridors at precisely 0347 ship time. their harsh wailing cutting through the usual peaceful hum of academic activity. Emergency lighting bathed the research vessel in crimson shadows as automated systems announced a crisis that no Velathi educational protocol had ever prepared them to handle. High Scholar Zephon rushed through the corridors toward the communication center, his usually immaculate robes billowing behind him as he moved faster than dignified academic bearing typically allowed. Behind him, other members of the Educational Council struggled to keep pace, their faces displaying the kind of panic that contradicted everything their civilization valued about rational, measured responses to unexpected situations. The crisis had begun innocuously enough. News of Elena's demonstration with the struggling mathematics students had spread throughout Velathi academic networks with unprecedented speed. What should have been a routine report about experimental teaching methods had instead triggered something approaching intellectual revolution across 17 different star systems. Dr. Carveth, the vessel's communication specialist, met Zephon at the entrance to the primary transmission chamber. Her usually calm demeanor showed cracks of stress that spoke volumes about the magnitude of the situation they faced. "The reports are coming in from every major educational facility in our territory," she said without preamble. "Students are demanding what they call human-style learning. Traditional classes are being disrupted by requests for physical activities and competitive exercises. Several facilities have reported complete breakdowns of instructional hierarchy." Zephon absorbed this information with growing alarm. The Velathi educational system had maintained perfect stability for over 3,000 years. Students accepted their roles as passive recipients of knowledge. Educators maintained their positions of unquestioned authority, and learning proceeded according to time-tested protocols that had proven their effectiveness across countless generations. "Show me the specific reports," he commanded. The holographic displays activated, revealing scenes that would have been incomprehensible to any Velathi observer just days earlier. Students at the prestigious Meridian Academy were engaging in heated debates with their instructors, challenging established theories and demanding hands-on verification of abstract concepts. The Crystalline Institute reported that pupils had abandoned their assigned seating arrangements to form collaborative groups that moved freely around their classrooms. Most disturbing of all were reports from the Advanced Sciences Complex, where graduate students had organized what they called intellectual combat sessions, where competing theories were tested through aggressive argumentation and experimental verification. The formal protocols that governed academic discourse had been abandoned in favor of passionate discussions that resembled the chaotic exchanges Elena had encouraged during her demonstration. "This is unprecedented," muttered Scholar Valen, whose expertise in institutional stability had never prepared him for anything remotely resembling the current crisis. "Our entire educational framework is collapsing because of one human's crude demonstration." The second phase of the crisis became apparent when reports arrived from facilities that had attempted to suppress student demands for alternative learning methods. Rather than returning to traditional obedience, students had organized coordinated resistance that demonstrated organizational capabilities no Velathi educational theory had predicted they possessed. At the Northern Research Campus, over 2,000 students had simultaneously walked out of their classes when administrators refused to permit experimental teaching approaches. They had established what they called learning camps in the facility's recreational areas, where they conducted their own educational activities using improvised materials and collaborative methods that bore striking resemblances to Elena's techniques. The Southern Scholastic Center reported that students had taken control of several laboratories to conduct unauthorized experiments that tested theoretical principles through direct manipulation rather than computer simulation. These activities violated numerous safety protocols and institutional regulations, yet the students involved demonstrated understanding of complex concepts that exceeded anything achieved through traditional instruction. "They are learning faster and more thoroughly than ever before. Drive," Carveth reported with obvious bewilderment. "Academic performance metrics are showing improvements that should be impossible under any known educational model." Zephon studied the data streams with increasing confusion. Every principle of Velathi pedagogy suggested that the chaotic conditions spreading throughout their educational system should produce decreased learning outcomes, student frustration, and eventual return to traditional methods. Instead, the evidence showed accelerated comprehension, increased enthusiasm, and innovative applications of knowledge that had never been observed under conventional instruction. The third wave of crisis reports revealed the true scope of the transformation occurring across Velathi space. Word of the educational revolution had reached other species within their sphere of influence, and alien students were demanding similar reforms to their own learning systems. Trade partners were questioning the effectiveness of educational approaches they had previously respected, while competing civilizations saw opportunity in the apparent weakness of Velathi academic institutions. The Zephyrian Confederacy has formally requested detailed information about human teaching methods, Scholar Valen reported with barely concealed horror. They claim they want to evaluate these techniques for potential implementation in their own academic programs. This development struck at the heart of Velathi identity. For millennia, they had maintained their position as the galaxy's premier educational power through the superiority of their teaching methods. Other species sent their most promising students to study at Velathi institutions, providing both prestige and economic benefits that supported their entire civilization. If human educational techniques proved superior to traditional Velathi approaches, the implications extended far beyond academic theory. Their entire society was built upon the assumption that they had achieved the pinnacle of educational development. The possibility that a primitive species from an obscure world had somehow surpassed their accomplishments threatened the fundamental basis of their cultural identity. "We need to contain this situation immediately," Zephon declared. "Prepare the advanced assessment protocols. If this human claims her methods are effective for all levels of instruction, we will test that assertion under conditions that will expose their limitations." Elena Vasquez had spent the hours following her initial demonstration in quarters that were comfortable by Velathi standards but felt sterile and cold compared to the vibrant environments she associated with effective learning. The curved walls pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns that were supposed to promote restful contemplation, but Elena found herself energized by the challenge she faced rather than soothed by her surroundings. She had encountered resistance to innovative teaching methods throughout her career, but the Velathi represented a unique case. Their educational system had achieved remarkable success through approaches that were diametrically opposed to everything Elena believed about effective learning. The rigid hierarchy, passive instruction, and elimination of physical activity had produced scholars of undeniable intellectual achievement. Yet, Elena recognized the warning signs she had observed in educational institutions across Earth before the colony ship's departure. When learning became too structured, too predictable, and too divorced from real-world application, students developed the ability to perform well on assessments, while losing the curiosity and creativity that drove true intellectual growth. The door to her quarters opened without warning, admitting High Scholar Zephon and two colleagues whose formal bearing suggested they were preparing for something significantly more challenging than her previous demonstration. Their expressions had hardened since their last encounter, displaying the kind of defensive hostility Elena had learned to recognize in educators who felt their professional competence was being questioned. "Dr. Vasquez," Zephon began without preamble, "your demonstration has created significant disruption throughout our educational system. Students are abandoning traditional learning approaches in favor of chaotic methods that violate established protocols." Elena smiled, recognizing the familiar pattern of institutional resistance to educational innovation. "That suggests your students were ready for more engaging approaches to learning. Change often seems chaotic when it challenges existing assumptions." "Change that destroys effective systems is not improvement," the second scholar interjected with obvious irritation. "Our methods have produced 3 millennia of continuous academic achievement. Your crude techniques may create temporary excitement, but they cannot possibly match the long-term effectiveness of proven approaches." "I'd be happy to demonstrate the scalability of human educational methods," Elena replied calmly. "What would you like me to prove?" Zephon activated a holographic display that showed complex information about advanced academic programs throughout Velathi space. "Our most gifted students are pursuing research in theoretical physics, advanced mathematics, and philosophical analysis that represents the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. If your methods possess genuine educational value, demonstrate their effectiveness with scholars who are already operating at the highest levels of academic performance." Elena studied the information with professional interest. The research topics were indeed sophisticated, dealing with concepts that would challenge even the most advanced human institutions. More importantly, the students described in the files had already achieved mastery through traditional Velathi approaches, making them potentially resistant to alternative methodologies. "How many students are we talking about?" she asked. 57 of our most accomplished young scholars, the third council member replied. "They have been selected from the top percentile of graduates from our most prestigious institutions. These individuals represent the future intellectual leadership of our civilization." Elena nodded thoughtfully. Working with high-achieving students presented different challenges than helping struggling learners. Gifted individuals often became invested in approaches that had brought them previous success, making them skeptical of alternative methods that seemed to contradict their established understanding of effective learning. "What specific outcomes would you consider evidence of success?" she inquired. Zephon consulted his tablet before responding. "These scholars are working on problems that have resisted solution for decades despite the efforts of our finest minds. If your methods can produce breakthroughs where traditional approaches have failed, we would consider that meaningful evidence of their effectiveness." The challenge was formidable, but exactly the kind of opportunity Elena had hoped for throughout her career. Too often, innovative teaching methods were dismissed without being given the chance to prove themselves with truly demanding intellectual challenges. The Velathi were offering her the opportunity to demonstrate that human educational approaches could succeed where their sophisticated traditional methods had reached their limits. The advanced instruction facility, where the demonstration would take place, represented the pinnacle of Velathi educational architecture. The chamber was enormous, with curved walls that could display three-dimensional models of any conceivable subject matter in perfect detail. The seating arrangements accommodated both individual and group work configurations, while sophisticated recording equipment captured every moment for later analysis. Elena arrived to find 57 young Velathi scholars arranged in perfect formation, their posture displaying the confident bearing of individuals who had excelled throughout their academic careers. Unlike the struggling students from her previous demonstration, these pupils showed no signs of frustration or uncertainty. They had succeeded brilliantly under traditional instruction, and saw no reason to doubt the methods that had brought them to the forefront of their generation. The Observing Educational Council had expanded to include representatives from every major academic institution in Velathi space. Word of the demonstration had spread throughout their scholarly networks, drawing observers who wanted to witness either the validation or debunking of human educational claims. The stakes had escalated far beyond simple pedagogical curiosity to encompass the fundamental question of whether Velathi educational supremacy could be challenged by primitive alien methods. "Distinguished scholars," Elena began, deliberately using more formal language than she had employed with the struggling students. "I understand you're working on research problems that have proven resistant to solution despite significant effort from talented investigators." One of the students, whose bearing suggested leadership among his peers, responded with the careful precision of someone accustomed to academic discourse. "Honored instructor, we are indeed pursuing advanced research in multiple disciplines. However, we have achieved our current status through mastery of established methods. We question whether alternative approaches could improve upon techniques that have already proven their effectiveness." Elena recognized the polite skepticism in his tone. These students had invested years in perfecting their abilities under traditional instruction. Asking them to abandon proven methods for experimental techniques required overcoming not just intellectual resistance, but emotional attachment to approaches that had defined their academic identities. "I'm not asking you to abandon anything that's working," Elena replied. "I'm suggesting we explore whether additional tools might help you break through barriers that conventional approaches haven't been able to overcome." She activated the holographic displays to show the research problems the students were pursuing. The topics were indeed formidable, representing cutting-edge investigations in theoretical physics, mathematical analysis, and philosophical inquiry that pushed the boundaries of current knowledge. "Let's start with something specific," Elena continued. "Who's working on a problem where you feel like you're close to a breakthrough but can't quite make the final connections?" Several students exchanged glances before one young woman raised her hand tentatively. "Instructor, I have been investigating quantum dimensional interactions that appear to violate established principles of spatial geometry. The mathematics suggest solutions that contradict physical reality as we understand it." Elena nodded encouragingly. "Describe the specific contradiction you're encountering." The student activated her personal display, showing equations of extraordinary complexity that dealt with relationships between multiple dimensional frameworks. Elena recognized advanced theoretical physics that exceeded anything in her direct experience, but she could identify the underlying issue the student faced. You're trying to visualize relationships that exist outside normal three-dimensional space, Elena observed. That's incredibly difficult when you're limited to thinking within conventional spatial frameworks. Precisely, the student agreed. Traditional analytical methods produce mathematical results that cannot be reconciled with physical intuition. Elena smiled as she recognized an opportunity to demonstrate the power of experiential learning applied to advanced theoretical concepts. What if we could create physical analogies that help you develop intuition for multi-dimensional relationships? The suggestion caused murmurs of skepticism among both students and observers. The idea that crude physical manipulation could assist with abstract theoretical physics violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of advanced intellectual work. "Honored instructor," another student interjected politely, "these concepts exist purely in mathematical space. Physical analogies would necessarily oversimplify the relationships we're investigating." "Actually," Elena replied, "physical analogies can reveal aspects of complex relationships that pure mathematical analysis often misses. Let me show you what I mean." Elena began with simple demonstrations using available materials to illustrate how multidimensional concepts could be understood through carefully constructed physical analogies. She used flexible materials to show how space could be curved, twisted, and folded in ways that created unexpected relationships between distant points. The students watched with polite attention but obvious skepticism as Elena constructed increasingly sophisticated physical models that illustrated theoretical principles. Their body language suggested they were humoring an instructor whose primitive methods might have entertainment value but could hardly contribute to serious intellectual investigation. The breakthrough came when Elena challenged the students to collaborate in building a large-scale physical model that represented the quantum-dimensional interactions the young woman had been investigating. Instead of working individually with abstract mathematics, the entire group contributed to constructing a representation they could manipulate and examine from different perspectives. As they worked together, something remarkable began to happen. Students who had been pursuing separate research problems discovered unexpected connections between their investigations. The physical model revealed relationships that had been invisible when each individual worked in isolation with purely mathematical approaches. "This configuration suggests a solution to the spatial contradiction," the young woman announced with growing excitement. "If we model the dimensional interaction as a folded surface rather than a linear progression, the mathematical paradox resolves into elegant symmetry." Other students clustered around the model, each seeing how the three-dimensional representation related to their own research problems. Discussions erupted as they began to understand how concepts from different disciplines could be integrated into comprehensive theoretical frameworks. Elena watched with satisfaction as the rigid hierarchy of traditional Velathi education dissolved into collaborative investigation. Students who had been trained to work independently began sharing insights and building upon each other's discoveries. The competitive element she introduced motivated them to push beyond their individual limitations, while the collaborative structure enabled breakthrough insights that no single researcher could have achieved alone. "This is highly irregular," High Scholar Zephan observed from the viewing chamber. "Proper research requires individual effort and careful peer review. This chaotic collaboration eliminates accountability and scholarly rigor." Yet the results spoke for themselves. Within hours, students had made connections and achieved insights that had eluded them through months of individual effort under traditional approaches. More importantly, they had developed enthusiasm for collaborative investigation that transformed the entire dynamic of advanced research. Elena escalated the demonstration by introducing what she called intellectual combat for advanced theoretical work. Students were organized into competing teams tasked with developing alternative solutions to the same research problems. The competitive pressure forced them to think more creatively and defend their approaches more rigorously than individual investigation ever required. The observing council watched in fascination and horror as their most accomplished students engaged in passionate debates about theoretical principles. The formal discourse protocols that governed traditional academic discussion were abandoned in favor of vigorous argumentation that tested ideas through aggressive intellectual challenge. "They're arguing like barbarians," one observer commented with obvious distress. Proper scholarly debate follows established protocols that ensure respectful consideration of all perspectives. "Actually," Elena replied, "they're testing their ideas more rigorously than polite academic discourse ever could. When you have to defend your theories against aggressive challenge, you discover weaknesses that gentle peer review often misses. The students themselves were experiencing something unprecedented in their academic careers. Instead of accepting established theories and building incrementally upon previous work, they were developing the confidence to challenge fundamental assumptions and propose radical alternatives that might revolutionize entire fields of study. The climax of the demonstration came when Elena introduced what she called, quote, theoretical warfare, an intensive exercise where competing teams had to solve extraordinarily complex problems under extreme time pressure, while facing active interference from their opponents. The exercise combined intellectual challenge with emotional stress in ways that pushed students far beyond their comfort zones. The Velathi observers watched in shocked silence as their civilization's most promising scholars engaged in something that resembled academic combat more than scholarly investigation. Students shouted out calculations, challenged each other's assumptions with aggressive intensity, and celebrated breakthroughs with emotional displays that violated every protocol of dignified academic behavior. Yet the intellectual results were undeniable. Problems that had resisted solution for decades yielded to the intense collaborative pressure of Elena's methods. Students achieved breakthrough insights that exceeded anything produced through traditional individual research approaches. "This is impossible," High Scholar Zephon whispered, as he watched his most accomplished students demonstrate intellectual capabilities that exceeded all previous measurements of their potential. "These methods violate every principle of proper educational development." Elena turned to address the assembled educational council with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime proving skeptics wrong. "Your students were always capable of these breakthroughs. Traditional methods taught them to think individually and avoid intellectual conflict. My approaches taught them to think collaboratively and embrace intellectual challenge." The demonstration concluded with a comprehensive assessment that revealed the true scope of what had been accomplished. Students had not only solved their individual research problems, but had developed new theoretical frameworks that integrated insights from multiple disciplines. More importantly, they had learned to work together in ways that multiplied their individual capabilities. As the last student completed the final challenge, Elena faced the assembled educational council with the knowledge that she had fundamentally challenged everything they believed about effective learning. The evidence of her method's effectiveness was overwhelming, but the implications extended far beyond simple pedagogical techniques. "The demonstration is complete," Elena announced. "Your most advanced students have achieved breakthroughs that exceed anything possible through traditional individual research. They've learned to collaborate effectively, think creatively under pressure, and challenge assumptions that previously limited their intellectual growth." High Scholar Zephon descended to the instruction chamber, his expression revealing the internal struggle of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by undeniable evidence. The traditional methods that had defined Velathi civilization for millennia had been surpassed by techniques that seemed primitive yet produced results that exceeded their highest aspirations. "The results are unprecedented," he admitted with obvious reluctance. "However, you have demonstrated these methods with only a small sample of our students. How can we know whether such approaches would be effective throughout our entire educational system?" Elena smiled with the confidence of an educator who had faced this exact challenge countless times throughout human history. "These methods work because they align with fundamental principles of how intelligent minds actually learn. They're not specific to humans or Velathi. They're universal approaches that any species can adapt to their particular needs." The silence that followed her statement was pregnant with implications that extended far beyond the enlightened thought's instruction chambers. The educational council faced a choice that would determine the future of their entire civilization. They could reject human methods and maintain their traditional approaches, or they could embrace revolutionary changes that might transform Velathi society in unpredictable ways. "There is one final test," High Scholar Zephon announced, with the tone of someone making a desperate last stand. "If human educational methods truly possess universal effectiveness, demonstrate their application to the most challenging teaching situation we can devise." Elena raised an eyebrow in curiosity. "What did you have in mind?" Zephon activated a communication channel that connected to the deepest levels of the research vessel. "We have encountered a situation that has defeated every educational approach we have attempted. If your methods can succeed where all of our expertise has failed, we will acknowledge their superiority." The chamber's displays activated to show a holding area deep within the ship's secure sections. Elena gasped as she recognized what she was seeing. A group of beings unlike anything she had encountered, their forms shifting and changing in ways that suggested non-corporeal intelligence constrained within energy containment fields. We discovered them during our investigation of a collapsed civilization, Zephon explained. They appear to be the survivors of a species that transcended physical existence but lost the ability to communicate with corporeal beings. Every attempt to establish meaningful contact has failed. Elena studied the shifting energy patterns with growing fascination. You want me to teach them? If they can be taught, Zephon replied. These beings possess knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself. But they cannot communicate through any method we have attempted. If human educational approaches can succeed where our most sophisticated techniques have failed, we will acknowledge their universal applicability. Elena felt the familiar excitement that had driven her throughout her career. The opportunity to prove that effective education could overcome any barrier, solve any problem, and reach any student regardless of the challenges involved. When do we begin? She asked. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.